Imagine the most powerful military force in the history of the world, with 2 aircraft carriers in the water, stealth bombers in the air, 40,000 troops spread across 19 bases, and warships in every body of water that matters. And then imagine a single phone call from a man in Riyadh that stopped all of it in its tracks. Not a war, not a treaty, one phone call. And just like that, the United States military found itself locked out of the very territory it had spent 70 years building, protecting, and bleeding for. This is not a story about the future. This is happening right now. And the man who made that call is someone the United States thought was its closest friend in the Arab world. The date is late January 2026. President Donald Trump has been threatening Iran for weeks. American warships are flooding into the Persian Gulf at a pace not seen since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. B-2 stealth bombers are being pre-positioned. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group arrives in the region. The USS Gerald Ford and its entire battle group follow. Pentagon officials are briefing Congress behind closed doors. The entire world is watching, waiting, holding its breath, wondering if the United States is about to go to war with Iran for the 3rd time in a generation. And right in the middle of all of this, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman picks up the phone. He dials Tehran. He tells Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian something that no one in Washington expected. He tells him that Saudi Arabia will not allow its territory, its airspace, or its land to be used by anyone, including the United States of America, to attack Iran. The Crown Prince of America's most important Gulf ally just called the enemy and promised them protection. And then, he made that position public for the entire world to hear. That moment changed everything. And to understand why, you have to go back much further than January 2026. You have to go back to a deal made in the sands of Arabia in 1945. A deal between an American president and a Saudi king that shaped the entire modern Middle East. And you have to understand how slowly, quietly, and deliberately Saudi Arabia has been walking away from that deal for years, and how the events of the last 12 months finally forced that walk to become a full sprint toward the exit. In February 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz ibn Saud aboard a U.S. warship in the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. The deal they made that day was simple and brutal in its logic. Saudi Arabia would supply oil. The United States would supply security. That arrangement lasted for 80 years. It turned Saudi Arabia from a desert kingdom into the wealthiest nation per capita on earth. It turned the United States into the undisputed military master of the Middle East. And it created a relationship that both sides called a partnership, but that, in practice, looked a lot more like a dependency. Saudi Arabia depending on American guns, and America depending on Saudi oil and Saudi bases and Saudi money flowing into American weapons companies. For 80 years, that deal held. Then, piece by piece, it started to fall apart. The first crack appeared not from outside pressure, but from inside Saudi Arabia itself. For decades, the presence of American troops on Saudi soil was one of the most sensitive political issues in the kingdom. Saudi Arabia contains Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in all of Islam. For many Muslims around the world, the idea of foreign soldiers stationed in that land was not just politically uncomfortable, it was a religious offense. One of the central grievances that drove a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden to declare war on the United States was precisely this: American military boots on sacred ground. The September 11th attacks, carried out by 15 Saudi citizens among others, forced Washington and Riyadh into a brutal conversation. The U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia had become, as one former American ambassador put it at the time, more of a burden than a benefit. In 2003, the United States quietly withdrew the bulk of its forces from Saudi soil, moving the centerpiece of its Gulf operations to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The Americans told themselves this was a strategic repositioning. The Saudis told themselves the same thing. Both were partly lying to themselves, because what had actually happened was that Saudi Arabia, for the first time, had said no to something America wanted, and America had agreed. That was the first no. What happened in September 2019 was the moment that permanently changed how Saudi Arabia thought about its American security guarantee. On a single morning, Iranian-backed forces launched a devastating swarm of drones and cruise missiles at 2 of the most critical oil facilities in the world, the Abqaiq processing facility and the Khurais oil field. The attack knocked out 5% of global oil supply overnight. It was the most significant strike on energy infrastructure anywhere on Earth in decades. Saudi oil fields were on fire. The kingdom was exposed, vulnerable, humiliated in front of the world. And where was America? Where was the security guarantee that Roosevelt and Ibn Saud had shaken hands over in 1945? Where were the 40,000 American troops, the missile batteries, the carrier groups? The answer shocked Riyadh to its core. America did nothing. The Trump administration, then, in its first term, condemned the attack and pointed fingers at Iran but took no military action. Saudi Arabia was on its own. In that single moment of inaction, the entire 80-year security arrangement between Riyadh and Washington cracked wide open. Saudi leadership looked at that burning oil field and quietly began asking a question they had never seriously asked before. If America would not defend us then, when will they? That question drove everything that came next. Mohammed bin Salman, already the real power behind the Saudi throne for years, began methodically building what analysts now call a multi-vector foreign policy. He opened back-channel talks with Iran, the kingdom's historic rival and supposed mortal enemy. He received Chinese President Xi Jinping in Riyadh for lavish state summits and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Beijing. He pushed Saudi Arabia into OPEC Plus deals that openly defied American demands for more oil production, infuriating the Biden White House and causing a crisis in U.S.-Saudi relations. So severe that American lawmakers introduced legislation demanding the removal of U.S. troops and missile defense systems from Saudi soil in retaliation. He began investing billions of dollars into building a domestic Saudi defense industry, training Saudi engineers and soldiers to maintain and operate weapon systems that previously required American contractors to run. He began, in other words, building a Saudi Arabia that could survive without American protection, not because he wanted to leave the American alliance, but because 2019 had taught him he might have to. Then came the summer of 2025, and the event that changed the military calculus of the entire region in ways that even the most informed analysts are still processing. In June 2025, a conflict that many people now call the 12-Day War erupted between Israel and Iran. Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities, the very facilities that had been the source of tension for 20 years. American B-2 stealth bombers joined the strikes. American submarine-launched missiles hit targets inside Iran. It was a direct, open act of war by the United States against a sovereign nation. And when it was over, Iran did something that Gulf leaders had been dreading in their worst nightmares. Iran fired missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the American base that houses the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command. The most important American military installation in the entire Middle East had just been struck by Iranian missiles. No Americans were killed in that attack, but the psychological impact on every Gulf leader watching from their palace windows was enormous and immediate. Every ruler from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi to Doha looked at those missile craters in the Qatari desert and thought the same thing. That could have been us. That could have been our oil fields, our airports, our desalination plants, our cities. The Americans go home when the war is over. We stay. That calculation, we stay, they leave, is the most important thing to understand about everything that has happened since. Because when President Trump began threatening Iran again in January 2026, when the protests inside Iran became a massacre, and Trump told Iranian protesters that help was on the way, when American warships started pouring into the Gulf at the fastest pace in 2 decades, the Gulf states did not cheer. They panicked. Senior Gulf officials began making urgent calls to Washington, desperate for information, desperate for clarity, desperate for any signal about what America actually intended to do. What were the objectives? What would come after? What would happen to them if Iran retaliated? And according to multiple senior Gulf officials who spoke to reporters at Fox News, The Washington Times, and CNN in the weeks that followed, they got no clear answers. Washington was not sharing its plans with its closest allies. The people who would bear the consequences of American military action were being kept in the dark by the country that kept its troops and missiles on their soil. And so Saudi Arabia did what every nation does when it feels that a powerful partner is about to drag it into a war it never chose. It drew a line. On January 28, 2026, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. He told him, clearly and without ambiguity, that Saudi Arabia would not allow its airspace or territory to be used for any military actions against Iran by any party, regardless of where the order came from. He then announced this position publicly, making it impossible for anyone in Washington to pretend they had not heard it. The very next day, the United Arab Emirates issued its own matching declaration. The UAE Foreign Ministry announced it would not allow any of its territory to be used as a staging ground for hostile military actions against Iran, and ruled out providing any logistical support. 2 of America's most critical Gulf allies, home to thousands of American troops, had just publicly announced they were opting out of whatever Washington was planning. The announcements were not made behind closed doors. They were made in press statements, in phone calls to enemy capitals, and in interviews with international media. They were designed to be heard. By Tehran, yes, but also by Washington. Now here's where this story becomes genuinely complicated. Because the headline, Saudi Arabia forces U.S. military out, captures something real, but also misses something equally important. The United States was not asked to pack its bags. American troops are still in Saudi Arabia. The bases are still operational. The training missions continue. The weapons sales continue. In fact, during Trump's visit to Riyadh in May 2025, just months before all of this erupted, Washington and Riyadh signed the largest arms deal in the history of the world, a $142 billion agreement covering everything from fighter jets to missile defense systems to drone technology. Saudi Arabia was simultaneously telling America it would not fight its wars while buying more American weapons than any country on earth had ever bought in a single agreement. That is not a relationship that is ending. That is a relationship that is being fundamentally renegotiated in real time in full public view. What Saudi Arabia was actually saying with its airspace ban was not get out. It was something more precise and, in some ways, more devastating to American strategic planning. It was saying, you can be here, but you cannot use here. You can station your troops on our land, but you cannot launch your wars from our land. You can sell us weapons, but we decide when and where and why those weapons are used. That distinction between hosting American power and enabling American power is the line that Saudi Arabia has just drawn. And it is a line that, once drawn, is almost impossible to undraw. Because Iran now knows the guarantee exists. Qatar now knows it exists. Every country in the region now knows it exists. The United States can no longer walk into any Gulf capital. And assume that the bases it has spent billions of dollars building and maintaining are automatically available for offensive military operations. The free pass is gone. The military implications of this are significant enough that American defense analysts spent weeks trying to work out exactly how much it mattered. The honest answer is that from a pure strike capability standpoint, Saudi airspace denial does not actually stop the United States from hitting Iran if Washington decides to act. This is because American military planners have deliberately structured the country's strike architecture to not depend on regional allies for the most sensitive operations. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber can fly from its home base in Missouri, refuel in the air, strike targets anywhere in Iran, and fly home without ever touching regional airspace. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, currently positioned near Oman, carries dozens of advanced combat aircraft, including F-35 stealth fighters, all capable of strikes from international waters. The United States has submarine-launched cruise missiles that can hit targets from beneath the surface of the ocean without any basing requirements at all. Saudi Arabia closing its airspace does not make America militarily impotent. What it does is make American military action far more expensive, more logistically complex, more dependent on assets that cannot be resupplied and rearmed quickly, and, critically, more visible to the world as an act of unilateral American aggression rather than a coalition operation with regional legitimacy. And that last point matters more than almost anything else, because the United States has learned, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, that wars without regional legitimacy tend to go very badly, very slowly, and very expensively. Saudi Arabia's denial does not take away the American sword. It takes away the American shield. It strips away the political cover that a regional coalition provides. It forces any American military action against Iran to stand entirely alone, without the blessing, the support, or the infrastructure of the world's largest oil-producing nation sitting right next door to the target. That is a serious constraint. Not an impossible one, but a serious one that reshapes the entire strategic calculation in ways that go far beyond the simple question of, can America do this? There's one more layer to this story that most coverage has missed entirely, and it may be the most important layer of all. Even as Saudi Arabia was publicly blocking American use of its territory for offensive operations, Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman, the Crown Prince's own brother, was privately telling American officials in Washington something entirely different. According to a report from Axios that broke in late January 2026, the defense minister told American officials that if the Trump administration chose not to strike Iran, it would only embolden the Iranian regime. A second Gulf official at the same meeting was quoted, warning that failing to act would leave Iran coming out of the confrontation stronger. So the Saudis were publicly protecting Iran while privately urging America to attack it. They were telling Tehran one thing in phone calls and telling Washington something almost completely opposite in private meetings. That is not confusion. That is masterful strategic ambiguity, executed at the highest level, and it reveals exactly what Saudi Arabia has become: not an American client state, not an Iranian ally, but an independent regional power playing every side simultaneously, protecting its own interests with the kind of cold-blooded pragmatism that most countries can only aspire to. This simultaneous game of protection and pressure reflects a deeper strategic reality about where Saudi Arabia is positioning itself for the next several decades. The kingdom signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan in September 2025, just months before the Iran crisis exploded. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state with the world's second-largest Muslim population and a military with genuine regional reach, is now formally committed to Saudi Arabia's defense, something that America has never agreed to in a formal treaty. Saudi Arabia has been in intensive negotiations to purchase advanced drone technology, has expanded cooperation with Chinese telecommunications giants, has built its own military satellite infrastructure, and is engaged in high-level defense talks with Turkey, Russia, and several other nations that Washington has traditionally viewed as adversaries or competitors. Riyadh is no longer putting all its eggs in the American basket. It is distributing them carefully, methodically, and with a level of strategic sophistication that the rest of the world is only beginning to understand. And then there is China. The shadow of Beijing falls across this entire story in ways that the American political conversation rarely acknowledges honestly. In December 2022, Saudi Arabia hosted Xi Jinping for a series of summits that produced a comprehensive strategic partnership between the Arab world and China. Since then, China has become Saudi Arabia's largest single trading partner, its most important customer for oil exports, and an increasingly critical partner in the Vision 2030 economic diversification program that MBS has staked his entire legacy on. China does not lecture Saudi Arabia about human rights. China does not sanction Saudi officials over journalist killings. China does not ask Saudi Arabia to choose sides in its confrontations with regional rivals. China shows up with money, with investment, with technology, and with zero political conditions attached. For a kingdom that has spent decades absorbing American criticism while paying American defense bills, the contrast is not subtle. Washington is beginning to understand, with increasing urgency, that Saudi Arabia now has an exit option it did not have in 1945, in 1973, or in 1991. And the knowledge that the exit exists changes the negotiating dynamic in every conversation the two countries have. None of this means the U.S.-Saudi alliance is over. The $142 billion arms deal tells you everything you need to know about how deeply intertwined these two countries remain. Saudi Arabia needs American weapons technology, American military training, American diplomatic cover at the United Nations, American financial markets, and American consumer demand for the oil that still funds 80% of the Saudi government's budget. The alliance is not ending, but it is being stripped of the unconditional quality that both sides use to take for granted. The days when America could show up at any Gulf base, point at any country on the map, and say, "We need this airspace," are over. Saudi Arabia has made that clear with a public declaration that it cannot walk back without losing face in front of both Iran and its own people. The free ride is finished. What this means for American military strategy in the Middle East is something that defense planners in the Pentagon are going to be working through for years. The entire architecture of American power projection in the Gulf was built on the assumption of cooperative basing, the idea that friendly governments would make their territory available for American operations in exchange for security guarantees and weapons sales. Saudi Arabia has now demonstrated that this assumption has an expiration date. Qatar, which hosts the largest American base in the region at Al Udeid, got a direct taste of what Iranian retaliation looks like when missiles landed inside that base after the 2025 strikes. The Qataris are not stupid. They watched what happened to their base after America's war, and they are asking the same questions the Saudis are asking. How long before our country becomes a target because of decisions that Washington made without consulting us? How long before the American security umbrella becomes an Iranian targeting grid? The irony at the center of all of this is almost too sharp to process. The United States has more military hardware in the Middle East right now than it has had since 2003. 2 carrier groups, hundreds of aircraft, 40,000 troops, missile batteries, submarines. The full weight of American military power is present in the Gulf in a way that is genuinely awe-inspiring in its scale. And yet, the kingdom that sits at the geographic and political heart of the Arab world, the kingdom whose oil funded the American economy through every major military campaign of the last half-century, the kingdom that houses the 2 holiest sites in Islam and controls the chokepoints through which a significant portion of global energy flows. That kingdom just told the United States that it cannot use its land for war. The hardware is there. The permission is gone. That gap between hardware and permission is what defines the new Middle East that is taking shape in 2026. It is a Middle East where American military power is still enormous, but where American political authority over its allies has quietly eroded to a degree that is only now becoming impossible to ignore. The $142 billion arms deal, the mutual defense pact with Pakistan, the partnerships with China, the airspace denial, the private pressure to act combined with the public refusal to help, all of it tells one coherent story about a country that spent 8 decades inside America's strategic orbit and has now decided to chart its own course. Not against America, not with Iran, not with China, for itself. For its own survival, its own economy, its own security, and its own future, in a region that has been torn apart by great power competition for generations, and that has decided, finally, that it is done being the battlefield. Mohammed bin Salman grew up watching what happened to countries in this region that did not control their own destinies. He watched Iraq get invaded. He watched Libya get destroyed. He watched Syria burn. He watched Egypt oscillate between American favor and American abandonment depending on who happened to be in the White House. He watched his own country get attacked in 2019 while its American protector stood by and did nothing. And he drew a conclusion that is now defining the foreign policy of the most important Arab state in the world. The conclusion is this: the only security guarantee worth having is the one you build for yourself. That is the story that the headline is trying to tell, even if it oversimplifies the details. Saudi Arabia did not force the American military out in a single dramatic moment. It did something slower, quieter, and far more permanent. It built the conditions, the alliances, the weapons, the diplomatic relationships, the economic alternatives that make it possible to say no to America without facing catastrophic consequences. And then, when the moment came, it said no. Not to all of American power, not to the alliance itself, but to the specific operational reality of American bases being used to start a war that Saudi Arabia would be left to survive alone. The American soldiers are still there. The bases are still open. The weapons are still flowing. But something that can never be restored has changed. The assumption is gone. The free pass is canceled. And the Middle East that emerges from this moment will be shaped not by what America decides to do, but by what Saudi Arabia decides to allow. For 70 years, those two things were the same. They are not anymore. And that, more than any troop withdrawal or base closure, is what the story of 2026 in the Middle East is actually about. And it did not happen overnight. The process of Saudi Arabia quietly rewriting its relationship with American military power has been unfolding for years, in moves that most Western media chose to interpret as minor diplomatic friction rather than the systematic strategic repositioning they actually represented. When Riyadh refused to increase oil production in late 2022, despite intense American pressure and a personal appeal from President Biden, an appeal that was publicly rebuffed in a way that humiliated the White House, that was not OPEC politics. That was Saudi Arabia telling Washington that the oil weapon is no longer a shared tool. When MBS refused to take Biden's phone calls for weeks during that same period, forcing the American president to eventually fly to Riyadh and receive what observers described as a barely respectful reception, that was not diplomatic awkwardness. That was a deliberate signal about the new hierarchy of this relationship. When Saudi Arabia began normalizing relations with Iran directly, brokered by China in March 2023, bypassing Washington entirely, and allowing Beijing to claim the diplomatic credit for one of the biggest regional realignments in decades, that was not coincidence. Every one of these moments was a brick being laid in the wall of Saudi strategic independence. By the time January 2026 arrived, the wall was already built. The world just did not notice until MBS placed that phone call to Tehran. What made the January 2026 airspace announcement so stunning to American officials was not its content. Some in Washington had quietly suspected this was coming, but its form. Saudi Arabia did not send a private diplomatic note. It did not work through back channels. The Crown Prince called the Iranian president directly and announced the decision publicly. He called Iran before he told Washington. He told Tehran before he told the Pentagon. That sequence was not an accident. It was a message, sent in the plainest possible language. Riyadh. His first call in a crisis is no longer to Washington. That is perhaps the single most significant signal in this entire story, because it tells you where Saudi Arabia's strategic center of gravity has shifted. Not to Beijing, not to Tehran, to Riyadh itself. Saudi Arabia is now calling its own shots, in its own order, on its own timeline. The ripple effects of that decision are already being felt in ways that extend far beyond the immediate Iran question. Every American ally in the Middle East and beyond is watching what Saudi Arabia has done and asking whether they can do the same. Turkey, already a NATO member that has spent years bucking American strategic preferences, is watching. Pakistan, now formally allied with Saudi Arabia and nuclear armed, is watching. Egypt, which has swung between American and Russian orbits for decades, is watching. Even Qatar, which hosts the biggest American base in the region and styles itself as Washington's indispensable Gulf partner, is watching. Because if Saudi Arabia, the country with the deepest pockets, the most oil, and the most diplomatic weight in the Arab world, can draw a line with America and not face consequences, then maybe everyone can. That domino logic is not hypothetical. It is already shaping how foreign ministries across the global south think about the durability of American security guarantees. Back inside Washington, the response to the Saudi announcement has been a masterclass in institutional awkwardness. American officials have publicly maintained that U.S. military options remain intact. And technically, as we have already established, they are correct, because the U.S. can still strike Iran from carriers and from Missouri. But privately, the calculation is far more painful. Because while America can strike Iran without Saudi airspace, it cannot easily sustain a prolonged campaign without Gulf basing infrastructure. The logistics of a sustained military campaign require land. They require fuel depots, ammunition storage, medical facilities, repair yards, rest facilities for personnel, and the thousand mundane necessities of keeping an air force in the field for weeks or months. Carriers are extraordinary strike platforms, but they are not self-sustaining campaign platforms. They run out of things, and those things have to come from somewhere. Without Gulf basin cooperation, a sustained American campaign against Iran becomes a dramatically more expensive, more difficult, and more politically fraught undertaking than any single carrier group's presence implies. The Pentagon knows this, the State Department knows this, and Saudi Arabia knows they know it. That mutual knowledge is the foundation of the new relationship that is being built in real time out of the rubble of the old one. America still has enormous leverage: the weapons sales, the financial system, the intelligence sharing, the diplomatic cover. Saudi Arabia still has enormous needs: security guarantees against Iran, continued access to advanced weapons technology, a seat at the table in Washington's strategic conversations. But the leverage and the needs are no longer as asymmetric as they were in 1945 or 1991 or even 2003. The relationship is being renegotiated between more equal partners than it has ever been before. And the opening bid from the Saudi side, made via a phone call to Tehran and a press statement seen around the world, is that American military power is welcome in the Gulf, but American wars are not. Welcome to stay, not welcome to fight. That is the new deal being offered. And Washington has not yet figured out whether to accept it, reject it, or simply pretend it is not happening. What is absolutely clear is that the Middle East of 2026 is not the Middle East that American strategists planned for when they built all those bases in the 1990s and 2000s. The assumptions that underpin the entire architecture of American power in the Gulf, loyal allies, free basing access, regional legitimacy for American operations, those assumptions have been tested to their breaking point by a decade of events. From the catastrophic aftermath of the Iraq invasion, to the Arab Spring, to the 2019 attack on Saudi oil fields, to the 2025 Iran-Israel war, and now to this. Each event has shifted the calculus. Each event has given regional powers more reason to hedge and less reason to follow. And each event has made the next Saudi no a little easier to say. The United States is not being expelled from the Middle East, but it is being renegotiated out of its position of unquestioned dominance. The era of American military command over the region, where Washington called the shots, the Allies provided the territory, and everyone else accommodated the results. That era is ending, not in a single dramatic moment, not in a single phone call from Riyadh to Tehran, but in a slow, grinding, irreversible shift of power from the country that provides the weapons to the countries that provide the ground. And the ground, it turns out, is worth more than anyone in Washington wanted to admit.